Well, my name is Toby Ziegler, and this is a body of work that I originally made for the Zabladovich collection in London for their space. And it's a group of sculptures and found objects. The sculptures are all derived from existing historical sculptures with their own narratives, sort of layers of narrative, objects that have accumulate stories and also lose information. And I suppose they also become autobiographical for me when I start working with them. But I'm still very conscious of the fact that these things have to have a certain combination of criteria before I start working with them. I find them usually they're objects I've never seen in the flesh. Often they're things that I've seen in books or found on the internet, and often I start working from very small thumbnail images like JPEGs with a small amount of visual information really, so there's a huge amount of invention and supposition that goes on when I start modelling them on 3D computer-aided design software. So I start by looking at photographs and then trying to glean information from them and actually create a form, a virtual form, on the computer. And then from those I start making models in paper. And frequently there's a kind of toing and froing process from the computer into something physical before I actually start making these sculptures out of aluminium. These are made out of polygons of oxidized aluminium riveted together. They're all objects which have narratives. For instance, the first sculpture you encounter of the head is based on an Iberian head, which Picasso stole from the Louvre, or had stolen from the Louvre for him to order. And I suppose I was interested in the idea that this object had been made by someone thousands of years ago for a particular reason, and had ended up in a museum, and then had this second life again when he got the object in his studio and started using it as a model for work. And I was interested in the story and went looking for the head, got in touch with the Louvre, and they said they'd actually sent it to the Museum of Antiquities in Saint-Germain. So then I got in touch with them, and they in turn said that they had it and I'd be welcome to go and photograph it, but they had lent it to someone, they thought, or otherwise they just couldn't find it. So they spent about 6 months searching in their storerooms, and this object seems to have gone missing again, which appealed to me. Somehow it felt like this thing that was absent, and it had accumulated stories, but it also kept disappearing. At one point, Picasso nearly threw it in the River Seine because he was convinced he was going to be deported if he got caught with it. Several of the objects that I choose to work from are lost in some way. The sculpture of the two figures, which is based on a Hellenic sculpture of Hermaphroditus and a satyr wrestling. It's the myth about the first ever hermaphrodite being born. The nymph tried to seduce Hermaphroditus, and he wasn't up for it. So she then prayed to her mother, who was conveniently a goddess, that they should be united in one body. And this also is a sculpture that was lost. It's a cast from the original that I've seen in reproduction, but as far as I could tell, that cast now has also been destroyed in the bombing of Dresden. So it was something that only existed in photographs. The large animal torso is based on a sculpture by Theodore Khalid, which basically finished his career. He worked in the 19th century, I think, as a kind of jobbing sculptor, doing cherubs for fountains and commissions, public commissions. And then one day he made this sculpture of a female figure on the back of a panther, and it was deemed to be too sort of provocative and sensual for the taste of the Berlin public at that time, and they were scandalised, and he never got another public commission after that. And the sculpture was totally neglected. So, again, I've only seen it in a photograph, but it's badly damaged. The figure's lost all of its limbs, the panther's lost its head and most of its limbs. It really just looks like a lump of rock. It looks like some sort of geological thing that you try and project figuration onto. And I suppose that's something I'm interested in, the desire to find figuration in abstract forms and this loss of information. And so I suppose in a way, when I start to model forms, it's a process of approximation. Sometimes it's about simplifying the form, reducing the amount of information, reducing the number of polygons. Frequently we start by modelling a form, and it's very detailed. It might be made of thousands of polygons, triangles that actually define that shape. And then we work and work and work until it's reduced sometimes to, 100, 200 polygons. And then I suppose the freight containers, which are air freight containers that have become a kind of motif that runs throughout this incarnation of the show, there's something about them. They have this implied narrative. They have their history etched all over them. They're these objects that have travelled all over the world for years. God knows how many miles they've covered. And they've been battered repeatedly from the inside by people's luggage. And so they have this really, perforated skin. They have this kind of hollowness. They're large masses, they're large volumes, but somehow you're very, very conscious of the hollowness of them, and also of the fact that they are just made of a skin. They look kind of inflated to me somehow. And I suppose that they have a kind of conceptual resonance with the sculptures for me, but also a formal one. They're both are made of aluminium, and both have a slightly kind of pneumatic quality to me. I think there's something about the sculptures that asks you to believe in their form, asks you to believe in the volume, but at the same time reminds you of the fact that they are hollow, they are just a skin. But then I suppose I also was conscious of the freight containers being more than just plinths. A lot of the sculptures sit on top of the freight containers, but I also wanted them to have a sort of parity. So at one point I had sculptures sitting on top of freight containers, and then I decided I wanted to elevate one of them and kind of treat it as an object in its own right, so it was less hierarchical. The sculpture in Gallery 4 is based on a pair of Staffordshire pottery dogs, and I've made a few different versions of these forms, and originally they were a pair of dogs. They're based on the dogs that, everyone seems to have on their mantelpieces, or had at a certain point in the 19th century. And I suppose there were things, again, about these dogs that intrigued me. They were originally based on Chinese lion dogs. And then during the colonial period, they came over here and became kind of domesticated. They became spaniels rather than lion dogs. And I think there was something about the loss of information, literally, in the fact that the moulds were used over and over and over again, until you find examples of them that barely resemble dogs at all. They just look like a lump. It's only really the painting, the glaze with like a face that anthropomorphizes them at all. So I worked on a few sculptures which had two pieces, a pair of dogs. And in a way I thought of them as portraits, but this one, the two have actually kind of morphed into each other. And you can, as you walk around the sculpture, you can still make out two tails, two heads, but they've become one lumpen form.